Derek Callahan's coffee mug trembled in his hand. Not from the cold, but from the pure, disorienting shock of what was standing in his doorway at 7 o'clock on a Saturday morning. Mara Ellison, CEO of Ellison Real Estate. A designer suitcase at her feet, her voice barely above a whisper. "I hope there's room." Behind him, Noah appeared in dinosaur pajamas, staring at the woman in the $1,000 coat standing in their hallway that smelled of old pipes and Mrs. Garner's cabbage soup. 12 hours earlier, Derek had been making a joke, just a throwaway line. Yet here she was. Friday nights in Southfield. Detroit had a particular rhythm for Derek Callahan, carefully choreographed, relentlessly exhausting, held together by the kind of optimism that doesn't announce itself because it can't afford to. He was 37 years old, and he worked 3 jobs the way other men breathed. Not because he loved it, but because stopping wasn't a real option.
I hope I'm not interrupting.
Plumbing
May I
during the
come in
week,
for a moment?
bartending at
absolutely. Come on
Clancy's
in.
Tavern on Friday nights, office cleaning in the financial district on Sunday mornings before Noah woke up, 3 jobs, 1 son, and an apartment building where the elevator worked 4 days out of 7 on a good week. The apartment was a 2-bedroom on the 4th floor of a building that had seen better decades. The heating clanged through the walls like a ghost with unresolved complaints. The refrigerator made a sound at 2 in the morning that Derek had stopped, fearing only because he'd run out of energy for it. The hallway smelled perpetually of his neighbor Phyllis Garner's cooking, comforting or oppressive depending on the day. Noah was 7 and in 2nd grade at Jefferson Elementary, smart enough to skip a grade and curious enough to ask questions that sometimes carved small pieces out of Derek's chest. 2 nights earlier, Derek had been on the living room floor applying duct tape to his son's sneakers for the 3rd time that month, the sole peeling at the toe like a tired smile, when Noah had looked up from his dinosaur book and asked why. They didn't have a house like Charlie Morrison's. Charlie lived 3 blocks over in a townhouse with a backyard and a swing set and parents who didn't have to choose between groceries and field trip fees. Derek had kept his eyes on the shoe. He said, with the grin he'd perfected over 3 years of single fatherhood, that shoes with special dad repairs ran faster than new ones. Pure science. The duct tape made them aerodynamic like race cars. Noah laughed. That clear, uncomplicated sound that made every early morning and every late night worth exactly what it cost, and Derek ruffled his sandy hair and pushed everything else down to wherever he stored the things he couldn't fix. Later, after Noah fell asleep clutching Mr. Peanuts, the stuffed elephant that had been Catherine's last gift, Derek sat at the kitchen table under the one bulb that still worked and looked at the bills spread across the scratched wood like bad news arranged alphabetically. Electric bill 60 days past due. Rent due in 5 days. The field trip permission slip, $20 that might as well have been $20,000. 3 increasingly pointed messages from the landlord containing the word eviction like a loaded gun placed on a table. He looked at Catherine's photograph on the wall, smiling at something off camera, her hair loose, the way she'd worn it on weekends. Gone 3 years, a drunk driver and 7 seconds on Route 12 had taken everything. Derek thought about her most at this particular table, in this particular silence, and always arrived at the same quiet prayer. Just 1 more month. Give him 1 more month to figure it out. The call from his emergency plumbing contact came at 9:17, just as he'd settled into his bartending rhythm at Clancy's. Emergency plumbing. Burst pipe in the penthouse of Ellison Plaza, $300 cash if he could handle it now. He didn't hesitate. He gestured to the bar manager, who nodded the way people nodded at Derek with the wordless understanding of someone who knew the situation without it ever needing to be explained. $300 meant electricity through the end of the month. It meant the field trip. It meant breathing room for exactly 1 more week. Ellison Plaza was 30 blocks north and 27 floors up, all glass and steel and architectural confidence that only serious money can sustain. Derek parked his van between a silver Mercedes and a Tesla, shouldered his tool bag, and followed the security guard's instructions. Penthouse, private elevator, don't drip on anything expensive. The elevator opened directly into the apartment, and Derek made a conscious effort not to react. 3,000 square feet of white. White leather, white walls, white marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows turning the city below into something that looked like jewelry scattered across black velvet. Magnificent in the way that empty cathedrals are magnificent, beautiful, yes, but built for a presence it no longer contained. Standing at those windows, her back to him, was a woman in a gray suit that had started the day perfectly pressed and ended it otherwise. Dark hair half undone from whatever it had been pinned into that morning. Her voice, when she spoke, was the voice of someone who had been crying for hours and had decided to stop because there was nothing left in it. The pipes are in the corner. I won't be in your way. Derek found the problem quickly, a compression fitting behind a credenza that likely cost more than 3 months of his rent, water spreading slowly across marble that had never known a spill before that evening. He worked for 30 minutes in near silence, just his tools and the occasional sound of her breathing from across the room, steadying itself by degrees. When he finished, he stood and wiped his hands and did what he always did when a space made him feel the weight of its atmosphere. He looked around at the white perfection, the curated emptiness, the windows offering a spectacular view of a city that had no idea this room existed, and said without particular planning, "Nice place. Looks lonely, though." Mara Ellison turned around for the first time. Her mascara had run in dark lines beneath her eyes. Whatever professional composure had been holding her together through the evening had let go, and she hadn't entirely gotten it back. She looked at him with something that wasn't quite surprise, more like the expression of someone who had been waiting for the obvious thing to be said and had long since stopped expecting it. "You're right," she said simply. "It's the loneliest place on earth." She told him her husband had left the week before. 15 years of marriage reduced to a forwarding address and a lawyer's business card. She ran a company that did nothing but match families to homes, and she came back every night to 3,000 square feet that held no evidence anyone lived there. No photographs, no books left face down, no coffee rings on any surface. Derek sat on the white sofa, which felt like a minor transgression in his work clothes, and told her about Catherine, about the drunk driver, about raising Noah alone while juggling 3 jobs, about duct taping shoes and calling it aerodynamics because a boy needed to believe the world was kind, about the field trip permission slip still unsigned on his kitchen counter. They talked until nearly midnight, 2 people doing what strangers sometimes do at that particular hour, telling the truth because they'd never see each other again and honesty costs less without ongoing consequences. When Derek finally stood to leave, he looked back at this woman and her empty palace and did what he always did to fill the silence before it filled him. He smiled and said, "If you ever get tired of all this space, you could move in with me. 2 bedrooms, falling apart, smells like whatever my neighbor's cooking. But at least there's laughter." Mara smiled, the first real expression he'd seen from her all night. Derek waved and took the elevator down, certain the conversation would dissolve by morning the way those conversations did. He was wrong. She was at his door at 7 the next morning. Designer suitcase at her feet, 4 quiet words in the hallway air. "I hope there's room." Noah peered from behind Derek's hip, assessed the situation with 7-year-old efficiency, and delivered his verdict. "She looks like she needs pancakes, Dad." The negotiation that followed was brief and surreal. Mara needed time to think, to remember who she had been before she became what she owned. She would pay 3 months' rent up front, $3,000. Derek's hand shook when he held the check. She would take the 2nd bedroom, the storage room that still held some of Catherine's things in boxes along the far wall. She had insisted those boxes stay. Derek would keep his room. Noah would stop sharing and finally have a space entirely his own. "This is insane," Derek said. "When has sanity ever led anywhere interesting?" she replied. Noah settled it. "She can stay, Dad. She looks like she needs pancakes and we have mix." The first week was a careful geography of 2 worlds, occupying the same square footage, with entirely different instruction manuals. Mara Ellison did not know how to use a coin-operated washing machine. This was not a metaphor. She genuinely stood in the basement laundry room, holding a quarter like an artifact from an unfamiliar civilization. Derek showed her the mechanics. Quarters here, fabric softener there, don't open the lid mid-cycle. She burned spaghetti 2 days later, filling the apartment with smoke, while Noah stood on his chair waving a dish towel at the smoke detector with the purposeful energy of a small traffic controller. Noah then supervised her first attempt at mac and cheese from the box with the gravity of someone transmitting essential cultural knowledge, declaring her at the end not hopeless, just learning. She sat on the living room floor with him one afternoon, her outfit accumulating carpet fuzz, while Noah explained with complete seriousness the complex political landscape of his second-grade class, who was allied with whom, who had committed a betrayal involving the last juice box, the ongoing territorial dispute over the good swings at recess. Mara listened with the attentiveness she normally brought to quarterly projections, asking clarifying questions that Noah received as appropriate due diligence. Derek watched from the kitchen doorway and felt something shift quietly in the region of his chest, something warm and unannounced, a sensation he hadn't experienced in 3 years. He recognized it with a kind of careful alarm and immediately, deliberately, turned back to the dishes. Thursday night, he came home from a sewage backup at a restaurant on Michigan Avenue to find Mara and Noah on the living room floor, a fort constructed from every pillow and blanket in the apartment erected around them, 2 pizza boxes open, Noah mid-explanation about something requiring both hands and considerable facial expression. Mara looked up when the door opened, hair loose, face completely clear of the armor she wore to the office, pizza sauce on one sleeve of what had probably been a very expensive shirt that morning, and she mouthed 2 words at him across the room. "Thank you." Derek stood in the doorway for a moment just looking at the 2 of them, then sat down in the fort without changing out of his work clothes. For 1 hour, the world was just 3 people sharing pizza under a roof made of bedsheets, while the city conducted its business outside, and none of it mattered at all. That night, after both of them had fallen asleep, Derek sat alone in the kitchen with a glass of water and Catherine's photograph. He looked at her face for a long time. The feeling from the kitchen doorway was still there, patient and unnamed, asking something he wasn't ready to answer. He only knew it was real, and that it mattered, and that he didn't know yet what to do with either of those things. The photograph surfaced on a Sunday. A photographer, nobody claimed the credit, nobody took the blame, had caught them at the grocery store on Saturday morning. Mara was pushing the cart. Noah was riding in the front basket with his arms stretched wide, laughing at something Derek had said. Derek was beside her, holding 2 boxes of cereal and comparing them with the focused attention of a man for whom the difference between brand and store brand represented a real financial calculation. The image was entirely ordinary and recognizably human. It was published that evening with a headline that was neither of those things. Billionaire CEO slums it with blue-collar boy toy. The story moved fast. By Sunday morning, it had accumulated the kind of mass that internet stories get when they carry the right mixture of class anxiety and romantic speculation. By Sunday afternoon, it had reached a size that made ignoring it professionally impossible. By Sunday evening, Mara's phone had become something she couldn't put down and couldn't bear to hold. She took call after call in the bedroom, emerging each time looking slightly smaller than when she'd gone in, the way water retreats from a shoreline in small degrees before a wave takes it entirely. She found Derek in the kitchen after Noah was asleep and told him what had happened. The board of Ellison Real Estate had convened an emergency session. They were giving her 72 hours to either vacate the apartment or produce documentation proving the arrangement was a legitimate business transaction. They used phrases like reputational liability and fiduciary exposure language precisely designed to make human choices sound like accounting errors requiring correction. She recited these phrases with the flatness of someone translating from a language she'd stopped believing in years ago. Derek listened carefully to all of it. Then he said the thing he believed was protective, which was also the wrong thing, though it would take him another hour to understand that fully. He said he had never asked her to stay. He said she could leave whenever she wanted. He meant it as generosity. He meant it as the only way he knew to give her something without asking anything in return. He meant it kindly, which was precisely how the damage got done. Mara went very still. Then, "Is that what you think this is? Me just passing through?" The argument that followed was their first, not loud, but real, in the way only disagreements about what people actually mean to each other can be real. Noah heard it through the wall. When Derek checked on him afterward, his son was sitting up in bed with Mr. Peanuts held against his chest, not crying, which was somehow worse. Derek sat with him in the dark for a while and said nothing useful, because nothing useful was available. Later, he stood outside Mara's door and knocked once. She opened it. Her eyes were red, and she didn't speak first. He said he was sorry. He said the offer had been about his own fear, not her freedom, that he'd handed her the exit because he was afraid of what it would mean if she chose to stay. She looked at him for a long moment and then nodded slowly. Not forgiveness exactly, the thing that arrives right before it and makes forgiveness possible. 3 weeks in, James Ellison reappeared. He was Mara's ex-husband, and he came back not with remorse but with leverage. The stock price of Ellison Group had moved unfavorably during the week of media coverage, and James, who retained shares from the divorce settlement, had decided the most efficient path to stability ran through a public narrative about his former wife's mental and emotional state. He reached out to 2 financial journalists with a prepared account. Mara was in crisis. She was vulnerable. She was being exploited by someone who had identified the right moment to take advantage of her pain. She needed protection from people who saw a clear opportunity in her loneliness. Raymond Foster, the board chairman, found this account useful. He invited James to a closed emergency session as supporting evidence of instability, presenting Mara's living arrangement not as a personal choice freely made, but as a symptom of compromised judgment requiring intervention. The session produced a memo that circulated among board members before Mara knew it had been written or sent. Then James came to Derek's building on a Wednesday afternoon. He stood in the doorway in a suit that cost more than Derek's van, with the smooth, unhurried delivery of a man who had spent years being believed without having to try particularly hard. He said Derek seemed like a decent man. He said Mara destroyed everything she touched, had done it to their marriage, their shared plans, their life together, and would do the same to Derek's if given enough time. He said Derek should think carefully about his son before this went further. Derek looked at him with the steady calm of a man who had been measured and found wanting by people in better suits his entire adult life and had stopped caring what the measurement said a long time ago. "You had 15 years with her," Derek said, "and let her be lonely every single day of them. Don't come here and talk to me about her." He closed the door. That evening, Mara heard that James had come. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment without speaking, processing something, then sat down across from Derek and told him the truth about the marriage, not the version she'd given him the night they met, which had the clean shape of a story edited for a stranger, but the harder and more honest one she'd been carrying since long before the divorce papers were filed. She had not been betrayed. She had simply disappeared. Gradually, completely. The work had consumed her in such small daily increments that by the time she looked up, there was nothing left of the person James had married. Not because he'd taken anything from her, but because she had poured every part of herself into building Ellison real estate until nothing remained for anything else. She told this not as an excuse, but as plain and honest accounting of what had actually happened between them. Derek listened without reorganizing what she said into something more comfortable, without offering reassurance or the kind of perspective that makes the speaker feel absolved before they're ready. He simply sat with it alongside her, in the way of someone who understands that certain truths need only to be witnessed, not resolved. The space between them was smaller after that night. Neither of them named it. The closeness had been arriving for weeks, in unmarked installments, a glance held a half-second longer than strictly necessary. The ease of two people who had stopped performing relaxation around each other, the quiet, natural awareness of where the other person was in a room at any given moment. What changed that evening was only that neither of them pretended anymore not to know what was happening. The pretense had simply run out, and what remained underneath it was something neither of them had been looking for, and neither of them was prepared to give back. The fourth week came down on all of them at once, the way pressure does when it has been building from too many directions for too long. The board issued its final ultimatum on a Tuesday. 48 hours. The message arrived by email, formal and clinical, written in the language of fiduciary duty and risk management language, precisely engineered to make human choices sound like accounting errors requiring correction. Mara read it at the kitchen table, then set her phone face down on the wood without speaking. On that same Tuesday morning, someone found Derek's van in the building parking lot with spray paint. The word they had chosen was gold digger, in red across the driver's side door. Derek stood in the early cold, looking at it for a while, his tool bag on the ground beside him, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not the tired, low-grade anger of financial stress, which had become so familiar it barely registered, but something hotter and cleaner. The burning fury of a man watching his life be written about by people who had never bothered to read it. Noah came home from school that afternoon, moving differently, putting his backpack down with unusual care, sitting at the kitchen table without reaching for the refrigerator, which was always the first sign. Derek sat across from him and waited. Noah said that kids at school had been saying things. About his dad. About Mara. About their weird fake family, which was the exact phrase that had been used, delivered with the particular cruelty that children can achieve when they sense a wound and don't yet have the conscience to leave it alone. Then Noah looked at his father with his mother's brown eyes and asked the question that went through Derek like a key finding its lock. Is Mara going to leave like Mom did? Derek sat outside on the hallway floor that evening, just sat with his back against the wall while the building moved around him. Phyllis Garner's door opened after a while, and she came out with 2 cups of tea, lowered herself carefully onto the floor beside him, with the patience of a woman in her 70s who had survived enough to know that certain things cannot be rushed through. They sat in silence. Then she said, very quietly, that her husband had been afraid for 30 years. Afraid of the right things, and the wrong things, and the nameless things in between. Afraid right up until the day he simply wasn't anymore, and by then half of their life together was already spent. Don't waste 30 years, Derek. He went back inside. Noah's light was off. On the kitchen table lay a piece of paper his son had left before going to sleep, 3 stick figures holding hands in front of a house, a sun above it, some flowers below, and at the top in second-grade handwriting, for Mara. So you remember us. The misspelled remember made it more devastating than correct spelling ever could have managed. It was nearly 3 in the morning when Derek heard movement from the kitchen and came out to find Mara sitting at the table with Noah's drawing held in both hands, crying with the silence of someone who has decided not to wake the people she loves. He sat down beside her. The kitchen light hummed steadily. Outside, Southfield ran its late-night routines without either of them. He said the thing he had been not saying for 4 weeks. He didn't want her to go not only because of Noah, though because of Noah too, but because of himself. Because somewhere between the first night in the penthouse and the duct tape conversation and the blanket fort and the quiet apology in the hallway, something had started that he didn't know the name of yet, but knew with complete certainty he didn't want to lose. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Okay," just that single word. And it was enough. Wednesday morning arrived and Derek put on his least-worn shirt, the one he kept for court dates and funerals, and told Mara he was going with her. "If you're fighting for us," he said, "you shouldn't fight alone." Noah announced he was coming too. He was wearing his school uniform. "These are my fancy clothes," he explained. They rode the elevator at Ellison Plaza together, and if Eugene the security guard registered the strangeness of the situation, he gave nothing away. The boardroom occupied the entire 25th floor. The table was long enough to lose perspective on, surrounded by 12 people whose careers had been constructed on the premise that decisions improve when sentiment is systematically removed. Raymond Foster sat at the head with the confidence of a man certain of his outcome. James Ellison sat against the wall, invited as evidence. Derek and Noah waited in the hallway. Noah's feet didn't reach the floor. He swung them back and forth and asked Derek if the people inside were going to be mean. Derek said some probably would be. Noah said that was okay, because mean people were usually just scared of something and didn't know how to say so. Derek had nothing to add to that. Inside, Mara stood at the far end of the table and refused to sit. Foster opened with precision stock performance, client withdrawals, media exposure, reputational damage. He used the word situation to describe her living arrangement, in the tone of someone describing something scraped from a shoe. Mara waited until he finished. Then she spoke not in the language of quarterly management, but plainly, the way she had learned to speak sitting on the floor of a 2-bedroom apartment in Southfield. She spoke about a 7-year-old who had taught her to make macaroni and cheese from a box and treated it as a genuine achievement. She spoke about a man who duct-taped his son's sneakers and told the boy the tape made them faster, because that boy needed to believe the world was fundamentally kind, even when the evidence ran against it. She said she had sold thousands of homes and forgotten what the word meant until 4 weeks in a water-stained apartment reminded her why it existed. Harold Brennan, the oldest member, the one present at the founding, cleared his throat. He said his son lived in a 6-bedroom house in Connecticut, and he hadn't seen him in just over 2 years. His grandchildren did not know him well. He had organized everything money could provide and had somehow failed, in that thoroughness, to give the one thing that lasts. He said Mara was reminding them all of something they had quietly misplaced. Patricia Guan, 35 and the newest member, said her daughter had asked the previous week why they never ate dinner together. She'd said she was building their future. Her daughter had said she'd rather have the present. The door opened. Noah stood in the doorway in his school uniform. He said his dad was not embarrassing. His voice held completely steady. His dad fixed things nobody else could fix, he said, and had fixed Mara when she was broken, and that was not something to be ashamed of. That was what superheroes did. Derek appeared behind him. Mara raised one hand, tears moving freely down her face. She said this child understood more about the value of a home than anyone in the room had demonstrated in the past month of deliberations. James Ellison looked at Noah for a long moment and said nothing. There was nothing left for him to usefully say. Foster called the vote. It moved around the table with the quiet momentum of something already decided by forces more fundamental than the official procedure. The room had shifted in the hour since Mara had begun speaking, and Foster seemed to feel it without being able to name it. Brennan voted first. Guan followed. Then the others. 10 in favor. 1 against Foster, alone in his position. 1 abstention Mara, who had refused from the beginning to vote on her own fate. In the hallway, she knelt and held Noah with the fierceness of someone who has understood, at last and fully, what they nearly lost. What none of them knew, walking out of Ellison Plaza into the November air, was that Foster was not finished. 3 weeks after the board meeting, while the story drifted toward older news, documents arrived in the hands of 2 financial journalists. Internal memos, strategically excerpted email chains, projections stripped of their surrounding context material that Foster had collected and curated and released in a form designed to suggest, without the surrounding reality, that Mara had made a series of decisions, prioritizing personal considerations over shareholder value. The resulting story was more damaging than the photograph had been, because it arrived wearing the clothes of fact and carried the weight of specificity that photographs cannot provide. The stock dropped 18% in 4 days. A major development partner suspended their contract, pending clarification of leadership stability. The board convened again, and this time the room had a different quality. Less about Mara's personal choices and more about whether the company could absorb the turbulence accumulating around her. Mara went quiet. Not the quiet of defeat, but the quiet of someone returning to the only tool they had ever fully trusted: work. Up before 5 every morning. Home past 11 most nights. Dinner eaten standing at the kitchen counter while reviewing documents on her laptop. Derek watched it happening from across the apartment, from the kitchen doorway, from the other end of the dinner table where Noah had started leaving portions of his meals untouched because he could feel something was wrong, even if he couldn't name it yet. Derek had heard this story before Mara had told it to him herself, the night she explained what had really ended her marriage: the gradual disappearance, the life contracting to professional necessity until nothing else remained. One evening he came home to find her at the kitchen table at 11:30, laptop open, takeout untouched beside it. He made coffee and set a cup next to her. Then he set something else on the table, a small drawing Noah had made that week. 3 stick figures, a sun, a house, and at the bottom in his handwriting, "Don't forget us." Mara looked at the drawing, then at Derek, then at the laptop screen. She closed it. The quiet click was the loudest sound in the room. "I'm doing it again, aren't I?" she said. Not quite a question. He said yes. Then, "But this time you caught it." The performance of competence that had been holding everything together these past weeks gave way to something smaller and more honest. He pulled his chair around beside hers. They stayed in the kitchen light for an hour, talking about nothing urgent, which was exactly what the moment required. The documents Foster had leaked were traced through a forensic audit commissioned by Harold Brennan, now acting board chair. Metadata and internal communication records assembled a clear and damning picture of the source. Foster resigned before the formal removal request could be delivered. The development partner returned once the full context was made available. The stock began its recovery slowly at first, then with the gathering momentum of a market that has processed its fear and come through to the other side intact. Mara used the returning stability to build what she had been drafting in her head since the first week in the apartment. The Ellison Home Fund, launched in February, $1 million annually directed toward housing assistance and financial counseling for single parents across Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana. She also implemented policies developed quietly over months: subsidized childcare for all Ellison employees, flexible scheduling for parents of young children, and an executive rotation program placing senior leadership on the company's front lines one day each month. The board approved everything unanimously. Harold Brennan said at the next shareholder meeting that a CEO who understood what a home actually was would always outperform one who merely sold them. The stock did not merely recover, it climbed. The loan came next. Mara offered. Derek refused, with the stubbornness of a man whose self-respect had been built on not owing things he hadn't earned. They went back and forth for 2 weeks, until Noah looked up from his homework one evening and said, "Why don't you just borrow it and pay it back? Then it's not a gift, it's just help." Both adults looked at each other. Neither had a response. The 7-year-old had located in 30 seconds what 2 grown people had been circling for 14 days. The paperwork was drawn up the following week. $20,000 at 3% interest. Mara added a handwritten note at the bottom. "You teach me to actually live." Derek signed it and said that was an unusual clause for a financial instrument. She said she was an unusual lender. Callahan Plumbing launched on a Thursday morning in March with a freshly lettered second-hand van and 2 employees, both single fathers from the support group Derek attended at a church 2 miles from the apartment. He priced his services deliberately. Fair rates in a market that routinely charged premium prices for emergency calls. Free work for elderly Southfield residents, no surcharge for middle-of-the-night calls from families in genuine distress. He turned down every shortcut, declined every introduction Mara offered, and built the business the only way he'd ever known how to build anything, through showing up and doing the work better than it needed to be done, and charging less than he could have gotten away with charging. The business grew through the loyalty that forms when people feel respected by someone who could have taken more and chose not to. He paid the loan back 6 months early. He brought the check to Mara on a Saturday evening with flowers from the shop on Clement Street and a card that said, "Thanks for believing in someone who'd stopped believing in himself." She read it in the kitchen doorway and was quiet for a moment. Then she said he'd overpaid on the flowers. He said they were worth it. The moment came on an ordinary Tuesday in April. Noah was asleep early, worn out from the science fair that had consumed 3 weekends and resulted in a third-place ribbon he wore around the apartment for an entire evening. Derek and Mara were doing the dishes, her washing, him drying, a routine established in the first week and maintained since without discussion. Their hands touched, reaching for the same bowl. Neither of them pulled back. Derek looked at her, and the thing that had been accumulating since October, unnamed, deferred, set aside through every crisis, arrived at the surface and stayed there. He said, "I don't know what this is, but I know I don't want it to stop," she said. "Neither do I." No announcement, no drama, just 2 people standing at a kitchen sink in Southfield, making the quietest and most significant decision of their recent lives, in the yellow light of an apartment that had recently started to smell unmistakably like home. 6 months later, on an October evening, with the same crispness as the night they had met, the 3 of them sat around a new table, solid oak, round, bought with the first month's profit from Callahan Plumbing. Noah was 8 now, captain of his school's coding club. He wore his Callahan Plumbing shirt on weekends with the loyalty of someone personally invested in the enterprise. At Career Day in September, he had introduced Mara to his class as Mara, who lives with us and makes good pancakes now, which had been reported back to Derek by 2 different parents at pickup. Mara had turned down New York. The board had proposed a national expansion of Ellison Real Estate, headquartered in Manhattan, the kind of offer that would have been, a year earlier, the only possible answer to any professional question she was asked. She said no at the meeting and repeated it when pressed. Brennan told the room that a CEO who understood what genuinely mattered would always outperform one who simply followed opportunity. She came home and told Derek. He looked at her across the kitchen. "You're staying?" She said yes. Where else would she go? This was home. That October evening, Noah cleared his throat and produced a folded paper from his backpack with the ceremony of someone delivering important information. He smoothed it on the table and read aloud, with deliberate enunciation that suggested practice. His teacher had asked the class to write about their families. He had written, "My family isn't normal. My mom died when I was 4, but she's still with us in pictures and in the way Dad smiles when he tells stories about her. Mara isn't my mom, but she chose to stay when she could have left. She says we saved her. But I think we saved each other. Dad says family is about choosing to show up every day. We choose each other every morning. That's better than normal. That's perfect." Mara did not try to conceal anything. She had stopped performing composure in this apartment sometime around November of the previous year and saw no reason to resume it. Derek reached across and took her hand and Noah's, and the 3 of them sat in the warm light of the chandelier Mara had found at an estate sale and Derek had rewired on a Sunday afternoon. Later, after Noah was asleep, Derek and Mara stood at the window looking out at Southfield. He took her hand deliberately, in the way of someone choosing something they intend to keep choosing. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. She looked at the lights of the city for a moment. "I regret," she said, "that it took me 33 years to understand the difference between having a house and having a home. But regret the choice? Not for a single day." She settled closer. The elevator down the hall was still broken. The radiator made its nightly argument with the pipes. Mrs. Garner's cooking came through the walls like a reminder that other lives were being lived nearby. Warmly, imperfectly. 2 bedrooms, 4 flights of stairs. 3 people who had found each other entirely by accident and stayed entirely on purpose. That was enough. That was, in every way that mattered, everything.